The old woman hit the signpost with her shoulder, and the wooden board swung loose and cracked against the cobblestones. Every head in Oakhaven's market square turned. Maya saw it happen from behind her stall. The woman was frail, white-haired, dressed in a plain brown traveling cloak with mud along the hem. She had been walking slowly through the crowd, one hand pressed against her lower back, squinting at the market stalls like someone who hadn't visited a town in a long while. Her foot caught on a loose stone, she stumbled sideways, and her shoulder knocked the magistrate's notice board clean off its post. The board split down the middle when it hit the ground, and that was when Magistrate Vane appeared. He came striding out of the court office on the east side of the square, his long black coat flapping behind him, his silver-topped walking stick already raised and pointing at the old woman like a weapon. "You there! Stand where you are!" The market went quiet. Sellers stopped mid-sentence. A boy carrying a crate of apples froze in the middle of the lane. Everyone in Oakhaven knew that voice, and everyone in Oakhaven knew what followed it. Magistrate Vane was not a tall man, but he carried himself as though he owned every inch of ground beneath his boots. He had held the position of magistrate for 11 years, and in that time the fines had doubled, the public punishments had tripled, and the complaints had gone nowhere because every letter of appeal passed through his office first. He stopped in front of the old woman and looked her up and down. "You've destroyed crown property," he said, loudly enough for the entire square to hear. "That signpost was erected under municipal order. The penalty is 2 shillings. The old woman blinked at him. She was still catching her breath from the stumble. "I beg your pardon, sir. I lost my footing. I meant no harm." 2 shillings, Vane repeated. He tapped his walking stick against the broken board. "Or I'll have my men escort you to the holding cell until the fine is settled." A murmur ran through the crowd. 2 shillings for a knocked signpost. That was a full week's earnings for most families in the village. The old woman reached into her cloak with trembling hands and searched her pockets. Her face fell. "I'm afraid I haven't any coin with me, sir. I've been traveling on foot. If you could allow me a day to—" "No extensions." Vane snapped his fingers, and 2 guards stepped forward from beside the court office. "Seize her traveling cloak as partial payment. It should fetch something at the second-hand dealer." "My cloak?" The woman pulled it tighter around her shoulders. "Sir, it is all I have against the cold. You should have considered that before you damaged public property." One of the guards reached for the old woman's collar. She flinched and stepped backward, nearly tripping again. Maya's hands closed into fists behind her stall. She had watched this scene play out a dozen times over the past year. The baker's son fined for leaving flour dust on the pavement. The widow on Mill Lane charged for her fence leaning 2 inches over the boundary. The old shoemaker penalized because his shop sign was faded, and therefore a disgrace to the village appearance. Every time, Vane collected his coins, wrote nothing in his ledger, and walked away richer. And every time, the people of Oakhaven lowered their eyes and said nothing. Maya grabbed the small tin box beneath her stall, where she kept the day's earnings. She had sold 6 jars of salve and a pouch of dried chamomile since morning. The coins inside amounted to exactly 2 shillings and 4pence. She walked straight into the middle of the square. Magistrate Vane. He turned. His eyes narrowed when he saw her. Maya was known in Oakhaven as the herbalist's daughter who ran the cottage clinic at the edge of the woods. She treated coughs, fevers, burns, and aching joints for anyone who could not afford the physician in the next town. She charged what people could spare, and often charged nothing at all. Vane had never liked her. A woman who gave things away for free made a man who took everything look worse by comparison. "Miss Farrow," he said flatly, "this does not concern you. It concerns me when a man takes a woman's only cloak in October." Maya held out the tin box and opened the lid. 2 shillings. That covers her fine. Vane stared at the coins. Then he stared at Maya. "You're paying the fine of a complete stranger." "I am, with your entire day's earnings." "I heard you the first time, magistrate. 2 shillings for a signpost that was already rotting at the base. Take the money and let her go." The crowd shifted. Someone near the baker's cart let out a breath that sounded close to a laugh. Vane's jaw tightened. He snatched 2 coins from the box, dropped them into his coat pocket without counting, and turned on his heel. "Clear this mess," he barked at his guards, gesturing at the broken signpost. Then he walked back toward the court office, without another word. Maya let out a slow breath. Her hands were shaking, but she kept them steady as she closed the tin box and turned to the old woman. "Are you all right, ma'am?" The woman was staring at Maya with an expression that was difficult to read. There was surprise in it, certainly, but there was something deeper beneath the surprise. Something that looked almost like recognition, though the 2 of them had never met. "You paid for me," the woman said quietly. "You don't even know my name." "I don't need to know your name to know that wasn't right." Maya tucked the tin box under her arm and offered her free hand. "Come. You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday. My cottage is just beyond the tree line. I'll make you something warm." The woman took Maya's hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm for someone her age, and her fingers were smooth in a way that did not match her plain, muddied cloak. "My name is Greta," she said. "Maya. Come along, Greta. We'll get you sorted." They walked together through the market, past the staring faces and the whispered conversations, past the guards who watched but did nothing, past the court office, where a curtain twitched in the upstairs window, and Magistrate Vane's silhouette stood watching them leave. He was already making plans, and 2 counties to the north, in a grand estate surrounded by 300 acres of private woodland, a letter arrived on the desk of Duke Caelan Ashford. The seal was from his mother's household steward. The letter contained a single line. "Your mother has not returned from her journey. She was expected 4 days ago." Caelan read it twice. Then he stood, called for his horse, and sent word to assemble his personal guard within the hour. Maya's cottage sat where the village ended, and the forest began. It was a small stone building with a thatched roof and a garden so overgrown with herbs that the air smelled of lavender and rosemary from 20 paces away. Dried bundles of sage and thyme hung from the ceiling beams inside, and every shelf was lined with glass jars containing salves, tinctures, and ground roots that Maya had prepared herself. Greta stood in the doorway and looked around the single room with quiet attention. The furniture was modest. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and a hearth with an iron kettle hanging over it. Everything was clean and carefully arranged. There was no waste here, no luxury, and no apology for the lack of either. "Sit by the fire," Maya said, pulling out the better of the 2 chairs. "I'll put the kettle on." Greta lowered herself into the chair with a wince. Her feet were swollen inside her boots, and her shoulders carried the stiffness of someone who had been walking far longer than her body could manage. Maya noticed. She always noticed. Years of treating the sick had trained her eye to read pain in the way a person sat, the way they held their breath, the way their fingers gripped the arm of a chair. She filled the kettle from the pail by the door, hung it over the fire, and then knelt in front of Greta. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the old woman's boots. Greta hesitated. Then she nodded. Maya unlaced the boots gently and eased them off. The stockings beneath were damp with sweat and the faint pink of blisters. She peeled them away and examined the feet without comment. Then she rose, took a shallow basin from the shelf, filled it with warm water from a second kettle she kept by the hearth, and added a handful of crushed calendula petals and a spoonful of salt. "Soak them for a while," Maya said, guiding Greta's feet into the basin. "The swelling will go down by evening." Greta let out a long breath as the warm water reached her skin. She closed her eyes and leaned back in the chair. "You do this for strangers often?" she asked. "I do this for anyone who walks through my door." Maya moved to the table and began slicing bread from a half loaf wrapped in cloth. She added a wedge of cheese and a small dish of honey. "Most of the village comes here when they're unwell. The physician in Hartfield charges 3 shillings for a consultation, and that's before he writes a single prescription. People here earn less than that in a week, so you treat them for free. I treat them for what they can give. Sometimes that's a few pennies. Sometimes it's a basket of eggs or a sack of flour. Sometimes it's nothing at all." Maya set the plate in front of Greta. "Eat. You need it more than I do." Greta picked up the bread and took a slow bite. She chewed carefully, watching Maya move around the cottage with the quiet efficiency of someone who had lived alone for a long time and had made peace with it. "You have no family here?" Greta asked. "My father taught me everything I know about herbs and remedies. He passed 3 winters ago. My mother died when I was young." Maya said it simply, the way a person speaks about grief that has settled into the bones and no longer needs dramatic expression. The cottage was his. The work was his. I carried it forward. Greta set down her bread. "And you gave up your entire day's earnings for a woman you had never seen before. You didn't hesitate for even a moment." Maya shrugged. "Hesitation is expensive when someone is about to lose their cloak in October." Something passed across Greta's face. A flicker of emotion she quickly tucked away behind a warm smile. She had spent decades in the drawing rooms of the aristocracy, surrounded by people who measured every kindness against its return. Generosity in those circles always came with a ledger. Here, in this tiny cottage at the edge of the woods, a young woman had emptied her purse for a stranger and was now kneeling on a stone floor to wash that stranger's feet. Greta had not been addressed as anything other than "Your Grace" or "My Lady" in 30 years. Tonight, she was simply Greta. And she found, to her own surprise, that she preferred it. They talked through the evening. Maya brewed chamomile tea and applied a poultice to the worst of Greta's blisters. Greta asked about the herbs in the jars, and Maya explained each one with the easy confidence of someone who loved her craft and knew it thoroughly. Greta asked careful questions, the kind that guided without revealing. She mentioned nothing of estates, titles, or a son who commanded soldiers. She spoke only of her journey, her sore feet, and her fondness for the countryside she had grown up in long ago. By the time the fire burned low, Greta was asleep in Maya's bed, wrapped in a quilt that smelled of dried lavender. Maya had insisted. She made her own bed on a folded blanket near the hearth, her coat rolled beneath her head as a pillow. She was nearly asleep when the knock came. It was sharp and urgent. 3 fast raps on the door. Maya was on her feet before the 4th. She opened the door to find Thomas Briggs, the cooper's son from 2 lanes over, standing in the dark with his cap in his hands and panic across his face. "Maya, you need to leave. Tonight." "What's happened?" "Vane's signed a seizure order. Your cottage, your shop stall, everything. He's claiming insubordination and public disruption. His men are coming at first light to board up the property and take your supplies." Maya stared at him. "He's seizing my home because I paid a fine? He's seizing your home because you made him look like a fool in front of the whole square." Thomas glanced over his shoulder. "I heard it from the clerk at the court office. Vane was furious after you left. He dictated the order before supper." Maya looked back into the cottage. Greta was still sleeping, her breathing slow and even. She had no money left, no family to take her in, and by morning she would have no home. "Thank you, Thomas," she said quietly. "Go home before anyone sees you here." He nodded, pulled his cap back on, and disappeared into the dark. Maya closed the door and leaned against it. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the fire crackle and the old woman breathe. Then she began to pack. Maya packed by candlelight. She moved through the cottage with purpose, choosing only what they could carry on foot. 2 leather satchels, her medical kit with the essential salves, bandages, and tinctures, a wrapped bundle of bread, cheese, and dried apples, a full water skin, a woolen blanket rolled tight and strapped to the outside of her bag, her father's field journal, worn soft at the spine, which contained every remedy he had ever taught her. She left behind the jars on the shelves, the dried herbs on the ceiling beams, the table where she had eaten 10,000 meals. She left behind the small wooden sign that hung beside the front door, painted in her father's hand, Pharaoh and daughter, herbalists. It was still dark when she woke Greta. "We have to go," Maya said gently. "I'll explain on the way." Greta asked no questions. She sat up, pulled on her boots without complaint, despite the blisters, and accepted the walking stick Maya offered her. There was something in the way she responded to urgency that surprised Maya. No panic, no confusion, just a calm, immediate readiness, as though she had lived through difficult mornings before and understood that speed mattered more than conversation. They left through the back garden, stepping over the low stone wall that separated Maya's herb beds from the forest floor. The October air was sharp and damp. Frost had begun to settle on the grass, and their breath came out in pale clouds. Maya led them along a narrow deer trail that wound north through the trees. She knew these woods thoroughly. Her father had walked them with her since she was old enough to carry a basket, teaching her which plants grew in shade and which needed open ground, where the streams ran clean and where the soil turned to bog after rainfall. She could navigate the whispering woods in full darkness by the smell of the earth alone. "Where are we going?" Greta asked after the first mile. She was keeping pace well enough, though Maya had slowed her stride to match the older woman's. "North. There's an old trade road that connects to the Hartfield district. If we reach it by midday, we can follow it toward the coaching inns along the River Wynn. From there, you can find safe passage to wherever you were heading before Oakhaven delayed you. And what about you?" Maya adjusted the strap of her satchel. "I'll sort myself out once you're settled. I know a few apothecaries in the northern towns who might take on an assistant." Greta walked in silence for a moment. "You lost your home because of me. I lost my home because Vane is a petty, greedy man who cannot stand being corrected. That has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me, child. You could have looked the other way in that square. Everyone else did." Maya held a branch aside so Greta could pass. "Then everyone else can sleep well tonight. I couldn't have." They reached the Old King's Road by late morning. It was a wide, rutted path that had once been a proper thoroughfare in the days when the Royal Mail coaches still ran this route. Now it was used mainly by farmers driving livestock to the northern markets and the occasional merchant cart headed toward Hartfield. Maya kept them on the edge of the road, close to the tree line, where they could step into cover quickly if needed. She did not yet know about the bounty. She only knew that Vane was vindictive and thorough, and a man who would seize a woman's home over a 2-shilling embarrassment would certainly send someone to look for her. Greta kept pace without complaint, though Maya could see the strain building in her legs. Every hour, Maya insisted they stop so she could check the old woman's feet and offer water. During one such rest, seated on a fallen oak beside the road, Greta watched Maya unwrap a fresh strip of linen and wind it carefully around a blister that had opened on her heel. "You remind me of someone," Greta said softly. "Who?" "My late husband. He was the sort of man who would give away his coat in a snowstorm and then act puzzled when people called him generous. He simply could not comprehend leaving someone in need when he had the means to help." Maya smiled. "He sounds like a good man." "He was." Greta paused. He died 12 years ago. Our son was young when it happened. Had to grow up faster than any boy should. Is your son expecting you somewhere? Greta looked away, toward the trees. I imagine he's rather worried about me by now. 2 counties north, he was more than worried. Duke Kalen Ashford had not slept. He had ridden through the night after receiving the steward's letter, covering the distance between his estate and his mother's household in 6 hours. When he arrived, the house staff confirmed what the letter had said. The Duchess Dowager had departed 8 days earlier for what she called a private pilgrimage to the village where she had been born. She had taken no escort. She had refused the carriage. She had packed a single bag and a plain traveling cloak, insisting that she wanted to walk the roads as she had done in her youth. She was expected back within 4 days. That was 4 days ago. Kalen stood in his mother's study, holding the note she had left on her writing desk. The handwriting was steady and clear. I wish to see Oakhaven once more, before my legs refuse me entirely. Do not send anyone after me. I will be home before the leaves turn. He folded the note and placed it inside his coat. Saddle the horses, he told Captain Hargrove, who waited by the door. 12 men. Light provisions. Fast pace. We ride south, toward the border villages. The border road covers 40 miles of open country, Your Grace. Do we have any indication of her precise route? She's heading to Oakhaven. That's where she grew up. Kalen pulled on his riding gloves. We'll cover every mile between here and that village. Ask at every inn, every farmstead, every crossroads. Someone will have seen her. Hargrove nodded and left. Kalen walked to the window and looked out at the gray morning sky. His mother was 68 years old, walking alone through open country, with no protection, no escort, and apparently no concern for the fact that her son would lose his mind with worry. She had always been stubborn. It was the one trait they shared completely. He mounted his horse within the hour, and the company rode south at a hard canter. Somewhere ahead of him, on a rutted road winding through the whispering woods, his mother was sitting on a fallen tree, while a young herbalist wrapped her blistered feet in clean linen. Neither of them knew the other existed. They reached the Silver River Inn on the evening of the 3rd day. Maya's feet were raw. She had given Greta the thicker pair of stockings from her pack 2 days earlier and had been walking in thin cotton since. The soles of her boots were wearing through on the left side, and a dull ache had settled into her calves that she could no longer ignore. But she said nothing about it, because Greta was struggling worse and refusing to admit it, and Maya understood that the old woman's pride was the only fuel keeping her legs moving. The inn sat at a crossroads where the Old King's Road met the River Wynn coaching route. It was a large, noisy establishment, built from dark timber and pale stone, with a stable yard on one side and a courtyard on the other, where travelers smoked pipes and warmed their hands over a fire pit. The windows glowed orange with lamplight, and the smell of roasting mutton drifted across the yard. One night, Maya said, a proper meal, a warm room, and we'll set off again at dawn. Can you afford a room? Maya reached into the inner pocket of her coat and produced a small cloth purse. Inside were 4 pennies and a 6pence she had kept separate from the tin box at her stall. Emergency money. Her father had taught her to always keep a coin hidden where the main purse could not find it. It won't buy us luxury, Maya said, but it should cover a shared room and supper. The inn was crowded. Farmers returning from the autumn livestock sales filled most of the benches, along with a handful of merchants, 2 clergymen traveling north, and a group of laborers drinking ale by the fireplace. Maya secured a small room on the upper floor, with a single bed and a washstand. She insisted Greta take the bed again, and Greta insisted she would do no such thing, and they argued about it quietly, until Greta sat down on the mattress and her knees made the decision for her. Maya went downstairs alone to fetch their supper. She was standing at the bar, waiting for the innkeeper to bring 2 bowls of stew when she heard the conversation at the table behind her. "Bounty out of Oakhaven," a man was saying. "Magistrates posted it on every notice board between here and Hartfield. 20 shillings for a young woman traveling with an elderly companion." Maya's hand tightened around the edge of the bar. "What's she done?" asked a second voice. "Abducted some old traveler, apparently. Taking her for ransom. The magistrate claims the old woman is a person of means, and the girl snatched her right out of the market square. 20 shillings is serious money. Aye, the magistrate's description says the girl is young, dark-haired, carries a leather medical satchel. Herbalist or some such." Maya turned her head just enough to see the 2 men. They were farmers, red-faced from ale, leaning over their tankards with the casual interest of people discussing someone else's misfortune. They had not looked at her. They did not know she was standing 3 feet away. She took the 2 bowls of stew from the innkeeper, walked upstairs without rushing, and closed the door of their room behind her. "Greta, we have a problem," she explained what she had heard. Greta listened with her hands folded in her lap, her expression shifting from surprise to something harder and colder. For a brief moment, the gentle old traveler disappeared, and in her place sat a woman who looked as though she had spent a lifetime handling situations far more dangerous than a corrupt village magistrate. "That wretched man," Greta said quietly. "He knows exactly what he's doing. If you're arrested on a kidnapping charge, no one will believe a word you say against him. Your name will be ruined before you ever see a courtroom." "I know," Maya said. "We need to leave tonight. After dark, through the back of the stable yard. There's a footpath along the river that leads north. I saw it when we came in. And if his men are already here, then we move quickly." They ate their stew in silence. Maya repacked the satchels and checked her medical kit. As she sorted through the pouches of dried herbs, her fingers paused on a handful of dried mullein leaves and a smaller pouch of powdered wild fennel. She held them up to the candlelight and thought for a moment. Then she emptied both pouches into a square of muslin cloth, added a pinch of dried sage, and tied the bundle tight with a length of twine, leaving a short tail hanging loose. "What is that?" Greta asked. "My father called it a shepherd's blind. The farmers in the hill country use it to smoke foxes out of dens without harming them. When you set the tail alight, it produces a thick white smoke that fills a room in seconds, stings the eyes but causes no real damage, clears within a few minutes. You learned this from your father?" "I learned everything from my father." It was near midnight when the sound reached them. Hooves on cobblestones, followed by heavy boots, crossing the courtyard below their window. Maya pressed herself against the wall and looked down through the edge of the curtain. 3 men in dark coats. One of them wore the brass-buttoned tunic of the Oakhaven Magistrate's Guard. They were speaking to the innkeeper at the front entrance, and the innkeeper was nodding and pointing upstairs. "Now," Maya whispered. She grabbed both satchels, slung one over each shoulder, and guided Greta to the door. The hallway outside was narrow and dim, lit by a single oil lamp mounted on the far wall. The staircase at the end led down to the main bar. Maya could already hear boots on the lower steps. She struck a match, touched it to the twine tail of the muslin bundle, and tossed it into the middle of the hallway. The smoke came fast. Within 5 seconds, a dense white cloud rolled outward from the bundle and swallowed the corridor. Maya heard a shout from the staircase, then coughing, then the sound of a man stumbling against the wall. She took Greta's hand and pulled her in the opposite direction, toward the back passage she had noticed when they first came upstairs. A narrow servants' corridor ran along the rear of the building, ending at a wooden door that opened onto the stable yard. The night air hit them cold and sharp. The stable yard was empty. Every horse was tied inside the stalls, and the stable boy had long gone to bed. Maya led Greta along the back wall, through a gap in the fence where a rail had rotted loose, and onto the muddy footpath that followed the river north. Behind them, white smoke poured from the upper windows of the Silver River Inn, and men's voices called out in confusion. Ahead of them the road was dark and open, and led nowhere safe. But it led away, and for now, that was enough. Duke Kalen Ashford had not eaten a full meal in 2 days. His men had noticed, though none of them dared say it aloud. Captain Hargrove had tried once, setting a plate of cold beef and bread on the map table inside the command tent, and Kalen had looked at it the way a man looks at an insult. Hargrove removed the plate and did not try again. They had made camp in the valley pass, where the river wind narrowed between 2 ridges of chalk hills. It was a natural bottleneck on the road south, and any traveler moving between the border villages and the northern districts would have to pass through it. Kalen had chosen the position deliberately. If his mother was on the road, she would come through here. 12 men, 6 tents, a picket line of horses, a small fire burning in the center of the camp, watched over by a rotation of sentries who kept their eyes on the road in both directions. The Duke's personal tent stood at the far end, larger than the rest, with a campaign table covered in maps, a lantern burning at all hours, and a cot that had not been slept in. Kalen stood at the edge of the camp in the gray light of early morning, his arms folded across his chest, watching the road. He was 31 years old, tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair cut short, and a jawline that looked as though it had been carved for the specific purpose of making other men uncomfortable. He wore a long riding coat over a plain waistcoat, and boots that had been expensive a week ago and were now caked with road dust. There was nothing about his clothing that announced his rank. He had left the ducal signet ring in his saddlebag and dressed like a country gentleman of moderate means. Drawing attention to his title would slow the search. People spoke more freely to a worried son than to a duke. "Your Grace," Hargrove approached from behind, holding a tin cup of tea that steamed in the cold air. He offered it without comment. Kalen took it this time. "Report," Kalen said. "Sergeant Cole spoke with a farmer 6 miles south of here last evening. The man recalled seeing an elderly woman matching her Grace's description, passing through the hamlet of Bridden 4 days ago. She was alone, walking north along the Old King's Road, and stopped to buy bread at the village bakery. 4 days ago." Kalen's grip tightened on the cup. She should have covered the distance between Bridden and here by now. On foot, even at a slow pace. That's 2 days at most. Unless she left the road, sir. Or unless she stopped somewhere along the way. Or unless something happened to her. Hargrove said nothing. He had served under the Duke for 7 years, first as a lieutenant in the county militia, and then as captain of the household guard. He had seen Kalen command rooms full of landowners and magistrates with steady authority. He had watched him settle territorial disputes between neighboring estates with a patience that bordered on stubbornness. He had never seen the man afraid. He was afraid now. It sat behind his eyes like a stone, and everything he said and did moved around it. "Double the patrol radius," Kalen said. "Send riders east and west along the feeder roads. I want every inn, every coaching house, every farmstead within 15 miles questioned by nightfall. Show them her description. 68 years old, white hair, brown traveling cloak, walking alone. Someone has seen her. There's something else, sir." Hargrove reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "One of the men pulled this from a notice board at the crossroads this morning." Kalen unfolded the paper. It was a bounty notice, printed in heavy black ink and stamped with an official magistrate's seal, from a village called Oakhaven. "Wanted, for the abduction and unlawful detainment of an elderly woman of means. A young woman, approximately 23 years of age, dark hair, carrying a leather medical satchel, known to be traveling with the abducted party. Reward, 20 shillings. By order of Magistrate H. Vane, Oakhaven District." Kalen read it twice. His face changed. An elderly woman of means, he said slowly. Abducted. Traveling under the control of a younger woman. I thought the same, sir. When was this posted? The ink is fresh. Within the last 2 days, I'd estimate. Kalen folded the paper and placed it inside his coat. His jaw was set tight, and a muscle worked beneath his left ear in the way it always did when his temper was building toward something dangerous. Find out everything you can about this magistrate. Vane, Oakhaven. I want to know who he is, how long he's held the position, and whether he has the authority to issue a bounty of this size. You believe this is connected to Her Grace? My mother left alone for a village in the southern border district. She has been missing for over a week. And now a bounty appears from that same district, claiming an elderly woman has been abducted by a younger companion. Kalen turned to face Hargrove directly. If someone has taken my mother, I will find them. And if this bounty is accurate, the woman responsible will answer for it. And if it isn't accurate? Kalen paused. The question hung between them. He looked back at the road, where the morning mist was beginning to thin, and the first shapes of distant trees emerged from the gray. Then the man who posted it will answer instead. He handed the empty cup back to Hargrove and walked toward the picket line where his horse stood saddled and waiting. The animal stamped and tossed its head when it saw him coming, sensing the tension in his stride. Break camp within the hour, Kalen called over his shoulder. We move south, along the Old King's Road. Every mile, every crossing, every bridge. Wherever they are, we will reach them before anyone collecting that bounty does. The camp stirred to life around him. Tents came down. Horses were led to water and brought back. Saddlebags were checked and tightened. The men moved with the efficient silence of soldiers who understood that their commander's patience had reached its limit, and that the careful, methodical search had just become something faster and harder. Kalen mounted his horse and turned its head south. Somewhere on the road ahead, his mother was walking with a stranger. Whether that stranger was a protector or a captor, he did not yet know. He intended to find out by morning. The stone bridge over the River Win was old enough that no one in the district could say with certainty who had built it. The arches were Roman in style, worn smooth by centuries of rain and river spray, and the road across it was just wide enough for a single cart to pass. On both sides, the river ran fast and cold, swollen by the autumn rains that had been falling steadily in the hills to the west. Maya and Greta reached the bridge at mid-morning on the 5th day. They had walked through the night after escaping the Silver River Inn, following the river path until it rejoined the main road 3 miles north. Maya had allowed them 4 hours of rest in a sheltered hollow beneath a stand of old beech trees, where she wrapped Greta in the woolen blanket and sat with her back against a trunk, listening to the darkness. At first light, they had continued north. The coaching route to the capital district lay on the other side of the bridge, and once they crossed it, they would be out of Oakhaven's jurisdiction entirely. Greta had grown quieter over the past day. She walked steadily, leaning on the stick Maya had cut for her, but there was a heaviness in her silence that went beyond physical exhaustion. Several times Maya caught her looking at the road behind them with an expression that seemed close to guilt. "We're nearly there," Maya said as the bridge came into view through the thinning trees. "Once we cross, we'll be in the Hartfield district. Vane has no authority beyond the river." "Maya." Greta stopped walking. "There is something I need to tell you. It can wait until we're across." "I'm not certain it can." Maya turned to look at her. The old woman's face was drawn and serious, and her hands were gripping the walking stick with a tension that had nothing to do with balance. "Whatever it is," Maya said gently, "tell me on the other side. We're exposed out here, and I'd rather have the river between us and anyone following before we stop to talk." Greta studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded and began walking again. They were 40 yards from the bridge when the riders appeared. They came from the north, which was the direction Maya had not been watching. A column of horsemen moved around the bend in the road at a steady trot, their formation tight and deliberate. 12 riders, armed, wearing dark coats and carrying themselves with the trained posture of men who had spent years in a saddle under military discipline. The lead rider held a pennant on a short staff, though the cloth was rolled and the insignia hidden. Maya stopped dead. "Into the trees," she whispered, reaching for Greta's arm. Too late. The front riders had already seen them. 2 men broke from the column and cantered forward, moving to either side of the road to cut off the tree line. Within seconds, the full company had fanned out into a loose half-circle that blocked the bridge, the road, and every path back into the woods. Maya stepped in front of Greta and faced the approaching riders. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but she kept her hands visible and her shoulders straight. Running was finished. Whatever happened now would happen here. The company parted, and a single rider walked his horse through the center of the line. He was tall, even in the saddle, dark-haired, unshaven, with the hollowed look of a man who had not slept properly in days. His riding coat was dusty, and his boots were mudded to the knee. But the horse beneath him was a thoroughbred worth more than most houses in Oakhaven, and the sword at his hip had a handle wrapped in silver wire. He carried no pennant, wore no signet, and displayed no crest. But every man in the company watched him the way soldiers watch a commanding officer, and when he raised his hand, the entire column went still. His eyes moved from Maya to the satchels on her shoulders, then to the leather medical kit visible at her side, then to Greta, standing behind her. His expression hardened. He swung down from his horse and walked toward them on foot, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. His stride was long and purposeful, and his gaze was fixed on Maya with a coldness that made her stomach drop. "You!" he said. His voice was low and carried an authority that had nothing to do with volume. "Step away from that woman." Maya did not move. "I said, step away, and I heard you." Maya's voice was steady, despite the fear climbing up her throat. "This woman is under my care. She is tired, she is injured, and she has done nothing wrong. Whoever you are, you have no cause to threaten us." The man's eyes narrowed. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The bounty notice. He held it up so Maya could see it. "A magistrate in Oakhaven says otherwise. He says you took this woman from the village square against her will and have been holding her for ransom. I have been searching for her for the better part of a week, and I am in no mood to negotiate with the person responsible." "That is a lie," Maya said fiercely. "Every word of it. I paid that woman's fine from my own pocket when your magistrate tried to steal her cloak. I gave up my home to keep her safe. I have walked for 5 days with blisters on my feet and nothing in my purse, and I will stand here until my legs give out before I let another man lay hands on her." The rider stared at her. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the stone, but before he could respond, Greta moved. She stepped out from behind Maya, drew herself up to her full height, and fixed the man with a stare that could have frozen the river solid. "Caelan Edward Ashford," she said, and her voice was suddenly nothing like the gentle old traveler Maya had known for 5 days. It was iron. It was a voice accustomed to obedience. "You put that sword hand down this instant. You are frightening the only person in this entire wretched country who has shown me a single ounce of genuine kindness, and I will not have it." The Duke's face went white. "Mother?" "Yes, mother. And if you speak one more word to this girl in that tone, I will ride your horse home myself and leave you to walk." Caelan stood perfectly still. His hand dropped from his sword. His mouth opened and closed once, without producing sound. Behind him, Captain Hargrove had the extraordinary good sense to look at the ground and say absolutely nothing. Maya stared at Greta, then at the Duke, then back at Greta. "Your son," she said slowly, "is a Duke." Greta took her hand and squeezed it. "We have quite a lot to discuss, dear." The Duke's pavilion was erected within the hour, on a flat clearing beside the river, 50 yards downstream from the bridge. It was a large canvas structure, tall enough for a man to stand upright at its center, with a campaign table, folding chairs, a portable writing desk, and a rug spread across the ground to keep the damp from rising. 2 lanterns hung from the crossbeam, casting warm yellow light across the interior as the afternoon sky darkened with the promise of rain. Maya sat on one side of the table. Kaelin sat on the other. Greta sat at the head. Between them, with a cup of hot broth in her hands and a thick wool blanket across her shoulders that 3 different soldiers had offered her, within minutes of her identity becoming known. The camp outside had transformed the moment Captain Hargrove quietly informed the men that the elderly woman was the Duchess Dowager. Bedrolls appeared. A fire was built. The company cook produced a pot of stew from provisions that had supposedly been running low, and suddenly there was enough food for a banquet. The soldiers moved with the careful, exaggerated attentiveness of men who understood that their commander's mother had been sleeping in hedgerows for 5 days and that someone would eventually be blamed for it. Inside the pavilion, Greta was talking, Kaelin was listening, and with every sentence, the expression on his face shifted further from the cold authority Maya had seen at the bridge toward something she had not expected from a man of his rank. "Shame. She paid my fine from her own earnings," Greta said, "every penny she had made that morning. Walked straight into the middle of the square and put herself between me and that magistrate, without a moment's thought for what it might cost her." Kaelin's eyes moved to Maya. She held his gaze but said nothing. "And when Vane signed the seizure order that night, she could have turned me out and begged forgiveness, returned to the square the next morning, apologized to the magistrate, and kept her home. Any sensible person would have." Greta set down her broth. Instead, she packed her bags, woke me before dawn, and walked me out of that village with everything she owned on her back. She chose a stranger over her own roof. "Why?" Kaelin asked. The question was directed at Maya, and his voice had lost the hard edge it carried at the bridge. It was quieter now, and genuinely confused. Maya considered the question. "Because your mother needed help, and I was there to give it. You didn't know who she was. That's correct. You had no reason to believe you'd ever be repaid." "I had no interest in being repaid. She was an old woman, being bullied by a man with authority and no conscience. I did what my father would have done." Kaelin leaned back in his chair and studied her. The candlelight caught the lines of exhaustion around his eyes and the tightness at the corners of his mouth. He had been searching for days, sleeping in short intervals on hard ground, driving his men south through every village and coaching road in the district. And during all of that, he had been carrying the bounty notice in his coat pocket, building a picture in his mind of the woman who had taken his mother, a kidnapper, a highway criminal, someone dangerous enough to seize an elderly traveler from a public square and disappear with her into the countryside. Instead, he had found a 23-year-old herbalist with blistered feet and an empty purse, who had given up everything she had for a woman she had known less than a day. He reached into his coat, pulled out the bounty notice, unfolded it, and placed it flat on the table between them. Then he looked at his mother. "Tell me about this magistrate," Greta told him. She described the scene in the market square in precise detail. The fine for a broken signpost, the attempt to seize her cloak, the guards reaching for her collar, the crowd that watched and did nothing. She described the seizure order against Maya's cottage, the bounty that twisted the truth into a kidnapping charge, and the 3 men who had come to the Silver River Inn with the clear intention of dragging Maya back to Oakhaven in chains. When she finished, Kalen was silent for a long time. His fingers rested on the edge of the bounty notice, and his thumb pressed against the paper hard enough to crease it. "How long has this man held office?" he asked. 11 years, from what Maya tells me. And from what I saw in that village, he has spent every one of those years filling his own pockets at the expense of people who have no power to stop him. Kalen folded the bounty notice slowly and placed it back inside his coat. Then he turned to Maya. "Miss Farrow, yes, I owe you an apology. At the bridge, I spoke to you as though you were a criminal. I acted on a document written by a man I had never met, and I did not give you the opportunity to speak before I passed judgment. That was wrong, and I am sorry for it." Maya blinked. In her experience, men with power did not apologize. They explained. They justified. They reframed their actions until the fault belonged to someone else. She had never heard a man of rank look a common woman in the eye and say plainly that he had been wrong. "Thank you," she said. "I accept your apology." Kalen nodded. Then he stood, walked to the entrance of the pavilion, and called for Captain Hargrove. "Send word to the household steward. Her Grace is safe and will be returning home within the week." He paused. "And Captain, prepare a formal ducal summons for the magistrate of Oakhaven. The name is Vane. Inform him that he is required to present himself and his official records before a tribunal in his own town square, 7 days from today. Attendance is compulsory." Hargrove saluted and left. Kalen turned back to Maya. "Your home, your shop, your name, everything that man took from you will be restored. You have my word." "And the villagers?" Maya asked. "The baker's son, the widow on Mill Lane, the old shoemaker. Vane has been stealing from all of them for years." Kalen held her gaze. "Every last penny. I will see to it personally." Greta looked at her son across the lantern light, then at the young herbalist sitting across the table with her chin raised and her worn boots still laced tight from 5 days of walking. She smiled into her broth and said nothing. Some things did not need to be spoken aloud. 7 days later, the Duke's company rode into Oakhaven. They arrived at mid-morning, when the market square was full and every stall was occupied. The sound of hooves on cobblestones brought the village to a standstill. 12 mounted soldiers in formation, riding 2 abreast, their horses groomed and their coats brushed clean. Behind them came a covered carriage drawn by a pair of matched greys, and behind the carriage rode Duke Kalen Ashford on his black thoroughbred, wearing his full ducal coat for the first time since leaving the capital. The coat made a difference. It was dark blue wool with silver buttons bearing the Ashford crest, cut long to the knee, with a standing collar trimmed in black velvet. The ducal signet ring was back on his hand, and the sword at his hip was polished. Every inch of him announced exactly who he was and precisely how much authority he carried. The carriage door opened, and Captain Hargrove offered his hand. Greta stepped down first, dressed in a traveling gown of deep burgundy that had been sent ahead from the estate. The plain brown cloak and muddied boots were gone. In their place stood the Duchess Dowager of Ashford, straight-backed and composed, with her white hair pinned beneath a velvet bonnet and a brooch at her throat that contained a sapphire the size of a thumbnail. The market square went very quiet. Maya stepped down after her. She wore a simple dress that Greta had insisted on lending her from the estate's wardrobe, clean and well-fitted, with her dark hair washed and pinned back. Her leather medical satchel hung at her side. She had refused to leave it behind. Magistrate Vane was not yet present. He had received the ducal summons 3 days earlier and had spent the intervening time in a state of frantic preparation. His clerk later testified that Vane had burned 2 ledgers in his office fireplace the night before the tribunal, and that he had attempted to send a letter to his cousin in Portsmouth, arranging passage on a merchant vessel. The letter was intercepted by one of Hargrove's men stationed at the postal office. When Vane finally appeared at the edge of the square, he was wearing his best coat and carrying his silver-topped walking stick and smiling the particular smile of a man who has convinced himself that everything will be fine. He had been told that the Duke was coming regarding the missing elderly traveler. He assumed, with the confidence of a man who had never been held accountable for anything, that he would be commended for raising the bounty that had helped locate the woman. He had rehearsed a short speech about civic duty and the vigilance of local governance. He stopped smiling when he saw Greta. The recognition was slow. First the face, then the posture, then the brooch, and then the awful, crawling understanding that the old woman he had fined for a broken signpost and tried to strip of her cloak was the Duchess Dowager of one of the most powerful estates in the country. Kalin dismounted and walked to the center of the square. A table and 2 chairs had been arranged there on his orders, along with a wooden stand for documents. The soldiers formed a perimeter around the space, facing outward. The message was clear. This was a court, and it was already in session. "Magistrate Vane," Kalin said, his voice carried across the square without effort. "Step forward." Vane walked toward the table. His walking stick tapped unevenly against the cobblestones, and his rehearsed smile had been replaced by something rigid and pale. "Your Grace, I am honored by your visit. I trust the matter of the missing traveler has been resolved satisfactorily. I took personal responsibility for issuing the bounty and—" "Sit down." Vane sat. Kalin remained standing. He placed 3 items on the table, one at a time. The bounty notice, a written statement bearing Greta's signature and seal, and a thick sheaf of papers bound with twine that Vane had never seen before. "Do you recognize this woman?" Kalin gestured toward Greta, who stood beside the carriage with her hands folded in front of her. Vane swallowed. "I believe I may have encountered her briefly in the—" "You fined her 2 shillings for accidentally knocking over a rotting signpost. You ordered your guards to seize her cloak when she could not pay. And when a young woman from this village stepped in to pay the fine on her behalf, you signed a seizure order against that woman's home and livelihood, and then issued a bounty accusing her of kidnapping." Kalin picked up the bounty notice and held it in front of Vane's face. "This document bears your seal and your signature. Do you deny it?" "Your Grace, the circumstances were—" "Do you deny it?" The square was silent. Every person in Oakhaven was watching. The baker's son, the widow from Mill Lane, the old shoemaker, the farmers and tradespeople who had paid Vane's unjust fines for 11 years and swallowed their anger because there was nowhere to send it. "I do not deny issuing the bounty," Vane said carefully. "I believed at the time that the elderly woman was in danger and acted to protect. You acted to protect yourself." Kalin picked up the sheaf of bound papers. "These are your financial records, Magistrate, seized from your office this morning by my men. They contain 11 years of fines, levies, and seizure orders, and not one of them matches the amounts recorded in the county treasury. You have been collecting fines and keeping the difference. Every shilling, every penny, from every person in this village who could not afford to question you." Vane's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Kalin turned to the crowd. "If any person here has been wrongfully fined, taxed, or penalized by this man during his time in office, you will be heard today. Step forward and give your account. Every stolen penny will be returned from Vane's personal estate." The baker's son stepped forward first, then the widow from Mill Lane, then the shoemaker, then a farmer from the Eastern Road, and a laundress, and a stable hand, and a schoolmaster, and a woman who ran the alehouse on the corner. One after another they came, and one after another they spoke. It took 2 hours. When the last account had been recorded by Hargrove's clerk, Kaelin turned back to Vane, who sat in his chair with his walking stick, gripped in both hands, and his face the color of old candle wax. Magistrate Henry Vane, by the authority vested in the Duchy of Ashford, you are hereby stripped of your title and removed from office. Your personal estate and holdings will be seized and liquidated. The full proceeds will be distributed among the residents of this village as restitution for 11 years of corruption. You are permanently banished from this province. If you are found within its borders after sunrise tomorrow, you will be arrested and held for criminal trial. Vane stood slowly. His walking stick trembled in his hand. He looked around the square at the faces of the people he had stolen from, searched for sympathy, and found none. 2 soldiers escorted him from the square. He did not look back. The crowd did not cheer. There was no celebration. What passed through the square instead was something quieter and heavier. Relief. The long exhale of people who had carried a weight for years and had just set it down. Maya stood beside the carriage and watched the old shoemaker collect his name from the clerk's restitution list. His hands were shaking, and he was trying very hard to keep his composure. She understood the feeling perfectly. 1 month later, the botanical gardens of the Ashford estate were in full bloom, despite the season. Maya had not believed it when she first saw them. The gardens stretched across 3 acres behind the main house, enclosed by a high stone wall, covered in climbing ivy. Inside, a network of gravel paths wound between raised beds of medicinal herbs, flowering shrubs, fruit trees trained along wire frames, and a long glass conservatory where tropical plants grew in heated air, piped through iron channels beneath the floor. There were specimens here that Maya had only read about in her father's journal. Foxglove and belladonna cultivated under controlled conditions. Rows of lavender so dense the air turned purple when the wind moved through them. A dedicated section for imported bark and root samples from the colonies, each one labeled in careful script on copper tags. The head gardener, a weathered man named Aldridge who had tended the estate grounds for 30 years, had watched Maya's face during that first tour and recognized something he had not expected. She was not impressed by the size of the gardens or the cost of the conservatory. She was reading the soil, checking the drainage channels, running her fingers along the underside of leaves to feel for disease. She knelt in the herb beds and smelled the earth the way a physician listens to a heartbeat. She knows what she's doing, Aldridge told Captain Hargrove that evening, which was the highest praise the old gardener had given anyone since the previous Duke was alive. The appointment had been Greta's suggestion and Kaelin's decision. Court apothecary was a formal position within the ducal household, responsible for overseeing the estate's medicinal gardens, preparing herbal remedies for the household and staff, and advising on public health matters across the duchy's villages. The position had been vacant for 6 years, since the previous apothecary had retired to the coast. No one had been found to replace him. The physicians in the capital considered it beneath their station, and the country herbalists lacked the formal credentials the estate steward required. Maya had no formal credentials either. What she had was 20 years of training from a father who had learned his craft from his father before him, a field journal containing 412 remedy formulations tested across 3 generations, and the endorsement of a Duchess dowager who informed the estate steward that if he wanted to discuss credentials, he was welcome to walk 40 miles on blistered feet, and then explained to her which certificate made a person qualified to save lives. The steward approved the appointment that afternoon. Maya's days at the estate settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. She rose early, as she always had. She walked the gardens before breakfast, checking the progress of her plantings, adjusting the soil mixtures, and recording observations in a new journal she had begun on her first day. After breakfast, she worked in the still room adjoining the conservatory, where she prepared tinctures, salves, and dried herb compounds that were distributed to the estate's tenant families and the surrounding villages. In the afternoons, she held open consultations in a small room beside the kitchen, where household staff and workers from the grounds could come to her with ailments they could not afford to take to a physician. She was good at the work, and the work was good to her. For the first time in her life, she had resources, proper equipment, glass vessels and copper distillation apparatus, a budget for supplies, a room of her own, with a bed that did not double as a treatment table, and a window that looked out over the gardens she now managed. Her cottage in Oakhaven had been restored as well. Kaylin had sent a crew of carpenters and masons within a week of the tribunal. They repaired the roof, replaced the front door Vane's men had boarded shut, restocked the shelves, and hung the old wooden sign back beside the entrance. Maya had asked that the cottage be kept open as a free clinic for the village, staffed by a young herbalist from Hartfield, whom she had trained herself during her first fortnight at the estate. The girl's name was Alice, and she had the same steady hands and calm manner that Maya remembered in her father. Greta visited the gardens every afternoon. She walked the paths slowly, leaning on the silver-handled cane Kaylin had given her to replace the stick Maya had cut from a branch in the Whispering Woods. She asked questions about the plants, listened carefully to Maya's answers, and offered opinions on the garden layout that were surprisingly informed. Before her marriage, Greta confided one afternoon she had grown herbs on the windowsill of her parents' cottage in Oakhaven. Her mother had taught her which plants eased a fever and which ones helped sleep through teething pain. She had not touched a garden in 40 years of living in grand houses, and she had missed it more than she realized. They developed an ease between them that needed no title or formality. In the gardens, Greta was simply Greta. Maya was simply Maya, and the 5 days they had spent on the road together, sleeping in hollows and fleeing through smoke-filled corridors, had built something between them that drawing rooms and dinner parties could never replicate. Kaylin noticed. He noticed most things, though he spoke about very few of them. He had been watching Maya for weeks. At first, it was the practical observation of a man assessing whether his appointment had been sound. He watched her work in the still room, saw the precision and care in her preparations, and confirmed what his mother had told him. She was exceptional at her craft. Then, the observation became something else. He noticed the way she spoke to the kitchen maids who came to her with burns and cuts, patient and warm, treating each person as though they were the only one who mattered. He noticed the way she stood her ground with Aldridge when they disagreed about planting schedules, firm and respectful, never yielding simply because he had more years. He noticed how she laughed when Greta told stories about the old Duke, a full and honest laugh that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. He noticed, most of all, that the estate felt different with her in it, warmer, more grounded, as though a room that had been slightly off balance for years had finally found its center. It was a Thursday evening in late November when he found her in the conservatory, labeling a tray of dried chamomile by lamplight. Rain was tapping against the glass roof, and the air inside was warm and heavy, with the scent of earth and green things growing. "Miss Farrow," she looked up. "Your Grace." He stood in the doorway for a moment, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain. The commanding presence she had seen at the bridge, the steady authority at the tribunal, the quiet confidence he carried through every room he entered, all of it had softened into something younger and less sure. "I have a question," he said, "and I want you to know, before I ask it, that your position here is secure, regardless of your answer. Your appointment is permanent. The gardens, the still room, the clinic in Oakhaven, none of that changes. Whatever you say tonight, you will always have a home on this estate." Maya set down her pen. That sounds like a man building a very careful wall before he opens a door. The corner of his mouth lifted. My mother said you were direct. Your mother is usually right. Kaelin stepped into the conservatory and stopped beside the work table. The lamplight caught the rain on the glass above them and scattered it across the stone floor in moving patterns. I have spent the last month watching you care for everyone around you with a generosity I have never encountered in any person of any station. You gave away your money for a stranger. You gave away your home. You walked for 5 days with nothing in your pockets and never once asked for anything in return. He paused. I would very much like to spend the rest of my life trying to match that standard. If you'll have me. Maya looked at him. The Duke of Ashford, standing in a greenhouse in the rain, asking an herbalist's daughter to marry him beside a tray of dried chamomile. You're certain? She asked. I have never been more certain of anything. Your mother approves. My mother threatened to disinherit me if I waited any longer. Maya laughed. That full, honest laugh he had been cataloging for weeks. Then yes, she said, I'll have you. The celebration was held the following week in the great hall of the Ashford estate. The household staff decorated the room with garlands of winter greenery and dried flowers from Maya's garden. Greta sat at the head of the table in her burgundy gown, beaming with a satisfaction that went beyond mere happiness. The tenants came from the surrounding villages. Alice traveled from Oakhaven with a basket of salves wrapped in ribbon as a gift. Even Aldridge attended, wearing a clean coat for what his colleagues swore was the first time in living memory. And in the center of it all, the herbalist's daughter and the Duke stood together, hand in hand, surrounded by the simple, extraordinary proof that kindness, freely given and expected nothing, had the power to change the course of a life. Greta raised her glass, and the hall fell quiet. To my son, she said, who rode 2 counties to find me, and to Maya, who walked 5 days to save me. She smiled. I always knew I raised a clever boy. He just needed a good woman to prove it. The hall erupted in laughter and raised glasses, and the rain on the windows sounded, for the first time that autumn, like applause.